Hi AP Biology students, so this is a photo story on photosynthesis. The major topics we're going to talk about within photosynthesis are what is a chloroplast, what is its structure, what different pigments are absorbed. There's a little graph that we're going to talk about with respect to them, so chlorophyll, carotenoids, lots of different pigments. And then within photosynthesis we have a couple of different reactions that happen. The first reaction is the light-dependent reaction, second reaction is the light-independent reaction, and lastly, we're going to talk about different adaptations for plants that are in very dry conditions. My recommendation while you're watching this is that if you are watching this for the first time and you don't have your class notes because you were out, I would recommend you actually putting the video on half of the screen and then the PowerPoint on the other half of the screen and following along on both, because I think if you're writing and listening, it's really, really helpful. As I said in the previous slide, just a reminder, have your notes packet out on one half of the screen and then this photo story on the other half. All the pictures that I'm using right now are taken from the PowerPoint, so you should know generally where I'm at. The first slide that you have talks about photosynthesis versus cellular respiration. Remember, as you can see in the picture, that the reactions are opposites of each other. So photosynthesis, what do you need for photosynthesis? Well, for a plant, you're going to need water, you're going to need light, and you're going to need carbon dioxide. And that produces, what does that produce? It produces glucose and oxygen. Well, those are the reactants of cellular respiration. So as you can see in the picture, it shows a little chloroplast with the light energy hitting it up the top for photosynthesis, and that produces organic molecules. The main organic molecule, remember organic means contains carbon, main organic molecule that you have is glucose. So it produces glucose and oxygen. And then if you look at the little arrow, it shows it going into that other structure, the orange structure, which is the mitochondria. And then it shows respiration occurring. Respiration produces CO2H2O, which then goes into the chloroplast, and on and on and on. Point being, photosynthesis and respiration are opposite processes, so you can't have one without the other because the reactants of one are the products of the other. Notice also the energy sources. So in photosynthesis, the energy has to go into the system, so that would be an endergonic reaction. Energy has to go in the form of light, whereas in respiration it produces energy in the form of ATP, making it an exergonic reaction. Also, keep in mind that in respiration you are losing electrons because they are given off to the glucose molecule. Okay, so we have our two reactions. We talked about briefly the difference between respiration and photosynthesis. Now we have to talk about where does photosynthesis take place. Just like when we did respiration, where did we start? Well, we talked about the mitochondria in respiration. Well, in photosynthesis, our major structure is the chloroplast. And if you look at that first picture over on the left, you see a leaf. Think about leaves. Those are the major structures where chloroplasts are going to be located. So in a root or in a stem, you're not going to have as many chloroplasts. Why would that be structurally? Well, if you think about it, the leaves are going to be the ones that have the greatest surface area exposed to the sun, so as a result, those are going to be the ones that have the most chloroplasts. So point being, leaves have lots of chloroplasts. Okay, that's the first picture. If you look at the picture on the right, you will see that in a leaf, you have many, many chloroplasts, and you also have this structure called the stomata. When you look at the stomata, it shows CO2 going into that little brown structure and O2 going out. So the stomata are basically the mouths of a plant. Plants obviously don't have mouths themselves, but the way that the carbon dioxide gets in and the oxygen gets out is through these stomata, which act like their mouths. This is a picture of a chloroplast. Obviously, just like with the mitochondria, you see that double membrane. Technically, in chloroplasts, you actually have a triple membrane, because if you notice, there is an outer membrane, there is an inner membrane, and then there is a thylakoid, which also has a membrane. The easiest way to remember the structure of a chloroplast is it's kind of like a stack of flattened pancakes, and there's many of them. So within the chloroplast, you have the thylakoids. A stack of thylakoids is called a granum, and the stroma is the space between the thylakoid and the inner membrane. So we need to know the structure of the chloroplast. Then the other major structure we have important for photosynthesis is the stomata. As we saw in the first picture, what's the function of stomata? It is the mouth. It lets in carbon dioxide and it gives off oxygen. In the process, however, the stomata loses water. In the process of, think back, what is the process by which plants give off water? Plants sweat. That would be transpiration. There is a great video embedded within the PowerPoint that shows stomata opening and closing. So if we look at the picture, the one on the left, the stomata, which is that white opening, that second box, is open. That means that the carbon dioxide can go in and the oxygen come back out. Well, if the carbon dioxide is going in and the oxygen's going out, also when the oxygen goes out, there's going to be some water going out. So the stomata is going to be open when there's lots of water in the cell. The cell is going to be okay with losing a little bit of its water. The structure that's above the stomata is what are called guard cells because they guard or protect the stomata from always being open. So they basically are the hinges or the doors that allow the stomata to open or close. Stomate, the word stomata or stomate only means opening. So the stomata isn't a structure itself. It is actually just the physical space between the guard cells. If you look at the picture on the right, the stomata is closed, and that would be when there's not much water around because the stomata doesn't want to lose any more water. So as a result, you're not going to have as much photosynthesis occurring. When we get towards the end and we're talking about adaptations, we'll talk about how, if the stomata is closed to prevent against water loss, how can you still have photosynthesis occurring? Within a chloroplast, you have molecules that actually absorb the light energy, and those are called pigments. So pigments absorb light energy. The major pigment that you have in a chloroplast is chlorophyll. There are a couple different types of chlorophyll. There's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. If you look at the green circles around the chemical structure, you should see the difference in the structures between chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. It's very, very, very similar. So point being, structure of a molecule affects its function, but they have very, very similar structures. They're going to have very, very similar functions. Another pigment that will come into play is called the carotenoids. If you've heard that word before, carotenoid, you may think of the word carotene in beta carotene, which is found in carrots. So that's going to give things orange pigments, whereas chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, based on the type of light energy they absorb, are going to make plants green. This picture shows an absorption spectrum, meaning how much light energy is absorbed by different pigments. You definitely need to understand how this picture works. So if we can orientate ourselves, there is the wavelength of light on the x-axis. It shows it in nanometers, nm. You don't need to know the nanometer units, but you need to understand that different colors of light, the visible light spectrum, have different wavelengths, and that in turn affects whether they can be absorbed by chlorophyll and by carotenoids. If a pigment is absorbed, it is taken into the cell. So as a result, you do not see it. If a pigment is reflected, right, if something's reflected, you actually physically see it. So if pigment's reflected, it is not taken as energy in. It is not useful for the cell, and you see it. That's what color it would produce or look like. So if we look at our absorption spectrum, for chlorophyll A, you should notice that its absorbance of light by chloroplast pigments is highest right around purple, and also right around red. So it has a peak at purple and has a peak at red. Meaning, if you have a typical plant, which has a lot of chlorophyll A, if you put it in front of a purple light or in front of a red light, it's going to grow really, really well because it can take in all of that light energy. If we look at chlorophyll B, it is very similar, although not identical. So it has a peak around purple-blue, and it has a peak around red-orange. Finally, if we look at carotenoids, aka beta-carotene, you will see that it has its peak around blue, slightly around green. And notice that it does not have any absorption around yellow-orange, which means that when you have carotenoids only present, when would you see an orange leaf? In the fall. So when you only have carotenoids, then the plant is going to reflect, not absorb, orange pigment, which is why the plant is orange. If you look at chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, they have a little tiny bit of absorbance in yellow, in orange, in every other color except green. They drop drastically right around green. Chlorophyll pigments cannot absorb green. Instead, they reflect it, the opposite of absorb. So as a result, plants are green. So in this first video, we talked about a couple of different things. Before you go on to the next video, look through the 5 questions that are shown on this page and make sure that you know the answers to them. I don't care if you write them down or if you just look back through your notes or if you just answer them in your head, but you need to know the answers to these questions before you move on. Usually we do that in class, but since you're doing this online, make sure you know the answers to these questions. Any questions that you do have, make sure you write them down because then we can talk about them in class. So I realize it's kind of hard to read, sorry about that. So the questions are, number 1, how do cell respiration and photosynthesis compare? Question number 2, what are the equations for each reaction? Make sure you include everything in those equations. 3, what is the function of stomata? 4, what are the 3 major pigments in plants? 5, what is the difference between an absorbed and reflected pigment? Along with that question, which one is used for energy in PS photosynthesis? So make sure before you go on to the next video that you know the answers to the questions in your head.